Emma Norris sat at the back of the classroom, trying to make herself as small as possible. At 10 years old, being the new kid was challenging enough, but being the new kid in the middle of the school year was social suicide. The walls of Westbrook Elementary seemed to close in as 22 pairs of eyes darted in her direction, sizing her up, dissecting her appearance, her clothes, her every move. "Class, I'd like you to welcome Emma Norris," Mrs. Peterson announced, her voice carrying the false enthusiasm of someone who had introduced too many new students over her 20-year teaching career. "She's joining us from Texas, and I expect you all to make her feel at home." Texas. That single word was enough to trigger the first round of whispers. Emma had heard it all before, jokes about cowboys, accents, and tumbleweeds. She wished she could disappear into the polished linoleum floor beneath her desk. Mrs. Peterson was a tall, imposing woman with rectangular glasses that magnified her piercing eyes. She ran her classroom with military precision, her lessons scheduled down to the minute. There was no room for disruption in Mrs. Peterson's world, and new students were definitely disruptions. "Now, as part of our getting to know you exercise, Emma, why don't you tell us something interesting about yourself or your family?" Emma felt her heart rate quicken. Public speaking was her nightmare, and 22 curious stares didn't help. She stood slowly, gripping the edges of her desk for support. "Well," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "my mom is a photographer, and my dad—" She paused, knowing what was coming. It was always the same. Always the disbelief, the snickers, the mockery. But her father had taught her to always tell the truth, no matter what. "My dad is Chucknorris." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the class erupted in laughter. Even Mrs. Peterson couldn't maintain her professional composure, a smirk breaking across her face before she quickly masked it with a stern expression. "Emma," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice dripping with condescension, "we appreciate creativity, but perhaps you could share something truthful about your family." Emma felt her cheeks burn. "But it is true," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "My dad is Chucknorris. He's away filming right now, but—" Mrs. Peterson cut her off with a raised hand. "That's enough, Emma. Chucknorris is a famous actor and martial artist. Making up stories won't help you make friends." The class erupted in another round of laughter. A boy in the front row mimicked a karate chop, while a girl behind Emma whispered, "What a weirdo." Emma sank back into her seat, eyes fixed on her desk, wishing she could be anywhere else. She knew the truth. She knew who her father was. But she also knew that no one ever believed her. Not until they met him. Not until it was too late. At home that evening, Emma's mother, Sarah, noticed her daughter's unusual silence during dinner. "How was your first day, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, pushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. At 35, Sarah Norris retained the beauty that had first caught Chuck's eye years ago. Her warm smile could light up a room, but tonight it couldn't penetrate Emma's gloom. "Same as always," Emma mumbled, pushing her green beans around her plate. "No one believes me about Dad." Sarah sighed, setting down her fork. They'd been through this before, in 3 different schools across 2 states. Being the daughter of Chuck Norris came with its own unique set of challenges, especially when your father insisted on living a somewhat normal life, away from the Hollywood spotlight. "Did you tell them he's filming in Bulgaria right now?" Sarah asked. Emma nodded. They just laughed harder. "Mrs. Peterson told me to stop making up stories." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Your father will be home in 2 weeks. We'll straighten this out then." "I don't want to go back, Mom," Emma whispered, a tear escaping down her cheek. Mrs. Peterson looked at me like I was crazy, and the kids were worse. Sarah's eyes hardened for a moment, a glimpse of the fierce protector beneath her gentle exterior. "We'll see about that. In the meantime, remember what your father always says." "The truth doesn't need defending," Emma finished, a small smile finally breaking through her tears. "It just needs time to be revealed." "Exactly," Sarah nodded, though in her mind, she was already formulating a plan. She didn't need to wait for Chuck to come home to address this situation. Sarah Norris was perfectly capable of handling bullies on her own. After all, She hadn't married Chuck Norris just for his movie star status or his legendary martial arts skills. She'd married him because they shared the same values, the same determination, the same unwavering commitment to justice. And nothing, not even a skeptical elementary school teacher, would be allowed to make her daughter cry. The next morning, as Sarah drove Emma to school, she noticed her daughter's knuckles turning white as she gripped her backpack. "Remember, Emma, you have nothing to prove to them. You know the truth." "But, Mom," Emma protested, "everyone thinks I'm a liar. Jake Miller told everyone to call me Chuckles because of my tall tales." Sarah's jaw tightened as she pulled into the school parking lot. "I'm going to speak with your teacher today. This needs to stop." "No." Emma's eyes widened in panic. "That'll just make it worse. Please, Mom, don't say anything." Sarah hesitated, recognizing the social minefield her daughter was navigating. "All right, but if it continues, I'm stepping in. That's non-negotiable." As Emma walked toward the school entrance, Sarah watched her daughter's small shoulders square with determination. She was Chuck's daughter, all right, stubborn, principled, and far braver than any 10-year-old should need to be. What Sarah didn't realize was that today would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would not only validate Emma's claims, but would also remind the world why Chuck Norris was not someone whose family you wanted to mess with. Days passed, and Emma's situation at school only worsened. The teasing had evolved from simple disbelief to outright mockery. Mrs. Peterson did little to discourage it, occasionally joining in with subtle jabs that she disguised as teachable moments. "And remember, class," she would say with a pointed glance at Emma, "in our personal narratives, we stick to facts, not fantasy." By Friday, Emma had developed a stomach ache every morning before school, a physical manifestation of her anxiety. She'd stopped mentioning her father altogether. But the damage was done. She was now known throughout the 5th grade as Chuck Jr. or the Karate Kid. What no one at Westbrook Elementary realized was that Sarah Norris had been meticulously documenting every instance of bullying. Each night, she gently coaxed the day's events from her daughter, typing them into a detailed log. 20 years as a photojournalist in conflict zones had taught Sarah the importance of documentation. She'd photographed wars, famines, and natural disasters. Compared to those challenges, building a case against a small-town teacher and her enabling of classroom bullying was child's play. On Monday morning, Sarah made her move. Instead of dropping Emma off at the usual spot, she parked the car and walked her daughter to class. The hallways were bustling with children, but they parted like the Red Sea when they saw Emma's mother. There was something about Sarah Norris that commanded attention. Perhaps it was her confident stride or the determined set of her jaw. Mrs. Peterson was writing the day's agenda on the whiteboard when Sarah knocked on the open classroom door. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm Sarah Norris, Emma's mother. I was hoping we could speak privately for a moment." The teacher's expression shifted from surprise to carefully constructed politeness. "Of course, Mrs. Norris. Class, please take out your silent reading books while I step outside." In the hallway, Sarah wasted no time. "I understand there's been some issues regarding my daughter's statements about her father." Mrs. Peterson's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Children often engage in fantasy, Mrs. Norris. Emma seems to be having trouble distinguishing between reality and fiction." Sarah's voice remained calm, but her eyes flashed dangerously. "My daughter doesn't lie, Mrs. Peterson. Her father is indeed Chuck Norris." The teacher's condescending laugh echoed in the empty hallway. "Mrs. Norris, if that is your name, I've been teaching for 20 years. I've had students claim their fathers were astronauts, presidents, and yes, even celebrities. I find it's best to gently guide them back to reality." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Perhaps this will convince you." She pulled up a family photo. Sarah, Emma, and Chuck Norris at their ranch in Texas, all smiles under bright summer sun. Mrs. Peterson squinted at the image. Anyone can Photoshop pictures these days. "How about this?" Sarah swiped to another photo, Emma's birth certificate, with Carlos Ray Chuck Norris clearly listed as father. "Documents can be falsified," Mrs. Peterson dismissed, her arrogance reaching new heights. "Mrs. Norris, I have a classroom full of students waiting." unless you have something important to discuss about Emma's actual academic performance. My daughter comes home crying every day because you've encouraged, an environment where she's ridiculed for telling the truth, Sarah said, her voice cold as steel. That ends today. Mrs. Peterson drew herself up to her full height, looking down her nose at Sarah. Are you threatening me? Not at all, Sarah replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm simply informing you that my husband returns from Bulgaria next week. He's very involved in Emma's education and will want to attend your parent-teacher conference day. I'm sure you'll find him quite convincing. Something flickered in Mrs. Peterson's eyes, a momentary doubt, but her arrogance quickly smothered it. I look forward to meeting this Chucknorris of yours. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a class to teach. As the teacher turned to go, Sarah called after her, One more thing, Mrs. Peterson. I've documented every instance of bullying that occurred in your classroom, with dates, times, and witnesses. The school board might find it interesting reading. For the first time, genuine concern crossed Mrs. Peterson's face. You wouldn't. Sarah's smile was sweet as honey, but her eyes remained hard as flint. I spent 15 years documenting war crimes in the Middle East. Trust me when I say that school board politics don't scare me. As Sarah walked away, she could feel Mrs. Peterson's stunned gaze boring into her back. She hadn't wanted to escalate the situation, but sometimes a show of force was necessary to protect what was yours. Chuck had taught her that. What Sarah didn't know was that her confrontation with Mrs. Peterson had been witnessed by the school janitor, Mr. Wilson, a retired Army veteran with a penchant for social media. By lunchtime, a garbled version of the encounter had spread through the school staff. By dinner time, it had transformed into a local Facebook rumor. Chucknorris coming to Westbrook Elementary to confront teacher. The small town of Westbrook had never been known for anything noteworthy, but that was about to change. Parent-teacher conference day arrived with an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching thunderstorm. Mrs. Peterson sat at her desk, reviewing her notes for the day's meetings, but her mind kept drifting to her last appointment slot. Emma Norris's parents. Over the past week, Mrs. Peterson had done some research. She Googled Chuck Norris' wife and found mentions of a woman named Gina O'Kelly, not Sarah Norris. She looked up recent Chuck Norris film projects and found nothing about Bulgaria. Every piece of evidence confirmed her suspicion. Sarah Norris was perpetuating an elaborate lie, and worse, involving her child in it. The conferences proceeded smoothly throughout the day. Parents came and went, discussing grade, behavior, and academic progress. Mrs. Peterson maintained her professional demeanor, but as the clock ticked closer to 4:30 p.m., the Norris appointment, her confidence began to waver. What if she was wrong? The thought flickered briefly before she dismissed it. No, it was impossible. Chuck Norris wouldn't be sending his child to a public school in a small town like Westbrook. The very idea was absurd. At precisely 4:28 p.m., there was a commotion in the hallway. Mrs. Peterson heard whispers, gasps, and the unmistakable sound of phone cameras clicking. She rolled her eyes. Sarah Norris was certainly committed to the charade, if she'd hired a Chuck Norris impersonator. The classroom door opened, and Sarah Norris entered, looking poised in a simple blue dress. Behind her came Emma, looking unusually confident. And then, Mrs. Peterson's mouth went dry. Standing in her classroom doorway, dressed in a black button-up shirt and jeans, was Chuck Norris. Not an impersonator, not a look-alike, the Chuck Norris. Mrs. Peterson, Sarah said with a smile that could freeze hell itself, I believe you know my husband, Chuck. Chuck Norris stepped forward, his presence filling the room, despite his average height. At 70-plus years of age, he still carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. His eyes, those famous, piercing eyes that had stared down countless villains on screen, were fixed on Mrs. Peterson with an intensity that made her shrink back in her chair. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Peterson, Chuck said, extending his hand. His voice was exactly as it sounded in movies, gravelly, authoritative, with that distinctive Texas drawl. I've heard a lot about you. Mrs. Peterson's hand trembled as she shook his. Mr. Norris? This is surprising. Chuck finished for her, settling into one of the small parent chairs that seemed comically undersized for his legendary status. I get that a lot. Sarah took the seat beside her husband, while Emma perched on a stool nearby, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Now, Chuck continued, his tone friendly but firm, I understand there's been some confusion about my daughter's honesty. Mrs. Peterson's face flushed crimson. Mr. Norris, you have to understand, claims like Emma's are unusual. We get children making up stories all the time. My daughter doesn't lie, Chuck interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with it. Her mother and I have raised her to value honesty above all else. Of course, Mrs. Peterson stammered, but surely you can see how her claims might seem fantastical to others. Chuck leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Peterson's face. What I see, ma'am, is an educator who encouraged ridicule rather than research. A simple Google search would have shown that I have a daughter named Emma from my second marriage. A phone call to the school office to confirm her enrollment records would have verified her last name. Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted to Sarah, who was watching the exchange with cool detachment. Instead, Chuck continued, his voice dangerously soft, you chose to humiliate a 10-year-old girl in front of her peers. You gave silent permission for her classmates to bully her. You made my daughter cry. The last 4 words hung in the air like a death sentence. I didn't mean to, Mrs. Peterson began, but Chuck raised a hand, silencing her immediately. In my day, he said, teachers were mentors. They protected children. They certainly didn't become the ringleader of a bullying campaign. Mrs. Peterson swiped at a tear that had escaped down her cheek. What can I do to make this right? She whispered. Chuck exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Tomorrow, Chuck said, you will publicly apologize to my daughter in front of the class. You will explain that Emma was telling the truth and that you were wrong. You will institute a zero-tolerance policy for bullying in your classroom. And, Sarah added, her voice like silk over steel, you will allow Chuck to speak to your class about integrity and the importance of verifying facts before jumping to conclusions. Mrs. Peterson nodded rapidly. Her earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Yes, of course. Anything. Chuck stood, extending his hand again. Then we have an understanding. As Mrs. Peterson shook his hand, she couldn't help but notice the strength in his grip, a reminder of the man's legendary status not just in Hollywood, but in martial arts circles worldwide. One more thing, Chuck added as they were leaving. Emma mentioned a boy, Jake Miller, who started calling her Chuckles. Mrs. Peterson swallowed hard. Yes, Jake can be challenging. A slow smile spread across Chuck's face. I'd like to have a word with him and his parents as well. As the Norris family walked out of the classroom, Emma's small hand tucked securely in her father's much larger one. Mrs. Peterson collapsed into her chair, her mind reeling. In all her years of teaching, she'd never felt so thoroughly humbled. Outside the school, a small crowd had gathered, parents, students, and staff who had heard the rumors and stayed to catch a glimpse of the legend. Chuck smiled politely but kept walking, his focus entirely on his family. What happened next would become the stuff of Westbrook legend, a story told and retold for years to come. The next morning, Westbrook Elementary was buzzing with excitement. Word had spread overnight that Chucknorris, yes, the Chucknorris, was coming to Mrs. Peterson's 5th grade class. Students from other grades found excuses to walk past the classroom, hoping for a glimpse of the action star. Teachers abandoned their lesson plans to cluster near the door. Even the principal, Dr. Martinez, had mysteriously relocated her morning meetings to the conference room across from Mrs. Peterson's classroom. Emma arrived early, accompanied by both her parents. She walked with her head held high, no longer the shrinking violet of the past weeks. How could she be, with Chuck Norris striding beside her, acknowledging the awestruck stares with casual nods? The classroom fell silent as they entered. 22 pairs of eyes widened in disbelief. Mrs. Peterson stood at the front, looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. Jake Miller, the ringleader of Emma's tormentors, sat frozen in his front row seat, his face pale as a ghost. Good morning, class, Mrs. Peterson began, her voice shaking slightly. "We have a special guest today. But first, I owe someone an apology." She turned to Emma, who stood straight back beside her father. "Emma, I was wrong to doubt you when you told us about your father. I should have verified the facts before dismissing your claims. I'm deeply sorry for any hurt I caused you and for allowing others to tease you about it." The class sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Peterson, the stern, unflappable Mrs. Peterson, was apologizing to a student. "Furthermore," she continued, "this incident has shown me that we need a stronger anti-bullying policy in our classroom. From today forward, any student caught teasing or bullying another will face immediate consequences." She turned to Chuck, who stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," he said, his Texas drawl filling the room. "Good morning, kids. For those who don't know me, I'm Chuck Norris, Emma's dad." A boy in the back raised his hand tentatively. "Are you really Chuck Norris? Like the one who fought Bruce Lee?" Chuck smiled. "The very same. Though I'd like to clarify that was a movie fight. Bruce was a friend and a great martial artist." A chorus of "whoa" and "cool" rippled through the classroom. "But I'm not here to talk about my movies," Chuck continued. "I'm here to talk about something more important: integrity and truth." For the next 20 minutes, Chuck Norris, 6-time world karate champion, actor, author, and philanthropist, spoke to a classroom of 5th graders about the importance of honesty, fact-checking, and standing up against bullying. He shared stories from his own childhood in rural Oklahoma, where he'd been a shy, non-athletic boy who was often picked on for being half Native American. "I was probably a lot like some of you," he told them. "Unsure of myself, scared sometimes. But I learned that character isn't about being tough on the outside. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." The children were mesmerized, hanging on his every word. Mrs. Peterson stood to the side, visibly moved by the transformation in her classroom. Then Chuck did something unexpected. He turned to Jake Miller, who seemed to be trying to disappear into his chair. "Jake, could you come up here for a moment?" The boy froze, terror written across his face. His eyes darted to the door, as if calculating his chances of escape. "It's okay, son," Chuck assured him. "I just want to talk." Reluctantly, Jake shuffled to the front of the classroom, keeping a safe distance from a martial arts legend. "Jake, I understand you've been calling my daughter Chuckles," Chuck said, his voice gentle but direct. Jake stared at his shoes, nodding almost imperceptibly. "You know, that was actually my nickname when I was about your age," Chuck said, surprising everyone in the room. "I was skinny, had red hair, and freckles all over my face. The other kids called me Chuckles because they thought I looked like a clown." Jake looked up, disbelief written across his face. "Really?" Chuck nodded. "Really. It hurt, just like I'm sure your words hurt Emma. But here's the thing, Jake. I decided not to let those words define me. Instead, I worked hard, trained harder, and eventually became the person standing in front of you today." He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "We all make mistakes, son. The question is, what do we do after we realize we've been wrong?" Jake's eyes welled with tears. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said, turning to face a classmate. "I didn't believe you, and I was mean. I won't do it again." Emma nodded, accepting the apology with a grace beyond her years. "Thank you, Jake," Chuck said. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. That's the first step toward becoming a person of integrity." The transformation in the classroom was palpable. By the time Chuck finished speaking and demonstrating a few basic self-defense moves, much to the children's delight, there wasn't a single student who hadn't been profoundly affected by his presence. As the Norris family prepared to leave, Mrs. Peterson approached them one last time. "Mr. and Mrs. Norris, Emma, I can't express how sorry I am for my behavior. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make amends." Chuck shook her hand firmly. "We all deserve second chances, Mrs. Peterson. Just remember, these children look to you for guidance. Your words have power." Sarah, who had been watching quietly from the sidelines, added, "We'll be checking in regularly to ensure Emma's school experience improves. I trust that won't be a problem." The subtle warning in her tone wasn't lost on Mrs. Peterson. "Of course not. Emma will be treated with the respect she deserves, as will all my students. As they walked the hallways of Westbrook Elementary, Chuck Norris's arm draped protectively around his daughter's shoulders. Students and teachers alike stopped to watch. But it wasn't just a celebrity they were seeing. It was the picture of a father who would move heaven and earth to protect his child. And in that moment, a new legend was born in Westbrook. Not about Chuck Norris, the action star, but about Chuck Norris, the father who had taught an entire school about integrity, courage, and the unbreakable bond between parent and child.